My best friend invited my ex to dinner without telling me while my girlfriend was out of town, so I ended our 20-year friendship but then found out my family helped plan it because they're racist. I, 32 have been with my girlfriend Jessica for about 2 years now. We met through work at a marketing firm downtown and things just clicked from day one. She's smart, driven, and we share the same goals about building a life together. We moved in together 8 months ago and honestly, everything has been great between us. We're not engaged yet, but we've talked about marriage and kids and we're on the same page about all of it. The problem is my best friend Sandra. We've known each other since we were 14. We grew up in the same neighborhood, went to the same high school, and even ended up at the same college across the state. She's always been like family to me. My mom treats her like another daughter and Sandra has been there through every major moment of my life. When my dad died during my sophomore year, she was the one who sat with me for hours when I couldn't sleep. When I failed my first big exam and thought about dropping out, she convinced me to stick with it. That kind of friendship doesn't come around twice. But here's where it gets complicated. Before Jessica, I dated a girl named Morgan for 6 years. We met freshman year of college and stayed together through graduation and for 2 years after that. Morgan and Sandra became close friends during that time. They'd go shopping together, have girls' nights, and Sandra was always telling me how lucky I was to have Morgan. Looking back, maybe she was a bit too invested in that relationship. Morgan and I broke up about 4 years ago. We'd grown apart after college. I got serious about my career and started working long hours to pay off student loans and build up some savings. Morgan wanted to travel, go out every weekend, and basically live like we were still in college. We fought about money constantly. She'd get upset when I didn't want to drop $200 on concert tickets or take spontaneous weekend trips to the beach. Eventually she told me I'd become boring and she wanted different things. She moved out and that was that. I won't lie, the breakup hit me hard. I'd spent 6 years with her and thought we'd end up married. Sandra was there for me through all of it. She'd come over with pizza, let me complain, and told me things would get better. But she also kept saying that Morgan still cared about me and that maybe once I was done with the intense work phase, we'd find our way back to each other. She said Morgan just needed time to get it out of her system and I should stay open to the possibility. I thought she was just trying to make me feel better, so I'd nod along, but I knew it was over. I stayed single for almost 2 years after that. Focused on work, paid off most of my debt, and got promoted. Then I met Jessica and everything changed. She understood my work ethic because she had the same drive. We'd cook dinner together instead of going out, watched movies at home, and saved money for actual goals like buying a house. It felt like I'd finally found someone who was on my wavelength. When I introduced Jessica to Sandra about 1.5 years ago, things seemed fine at first. Sandra was friendly and welcoming. But then she started making these comments. Small things at first that I brushed off. We'd be talking about looking at houses and Sandra would say something like, "Oh, that's funny because Morgan and I used to look at houses in that exact neighborhood and pick out which ones we'd want." Or Jessica and I would mention wanting to take a trip somewhere and Sandra would bring up how Morgan and I had planned to go there for our honeymoon before we broke up. Jessica noticed it too, but she didn't say anything for months. She'd just get quiet whenever Sandra did it. I finally asked her about it after Sandra mentioned Morgan for probably the 20th time during a dinner at Sandra's place. Jessica said she'd noticed but didn't want to cause problems between Sandra and me. She said it felt like Sandra was trying to remind her that Morgan had been there first and had some kind of claim on me. Jessica said every time Sandra brought up Morgan, it felt like she was being told she was the replacement who'd never measure up. That really bothered me. I talked to Sandra the next day and asked her to stop bringing up Morgan around Jessica. Sandra acted confused. She said Morgan had been part of my life for 6 years, so obviously she'd come up in old stories. She asked me why it bothered me so much and whether I still had feelings for Morgan that I was trying to hide. That made me angry because it put the blame back on me somehow. Things got worse from there. Sandra is close with my mom and my younger sister Katie, and she's at every family dinner and birthday party. My mom and Katie both told me I was being too sensitive when I mentioned Sandra's behavior. They said Morgan had been around for years and it was natural for her to come up in conversation. They pointed out that Morgan and I broke up years ago, so I shouldn't still be weird about hearing her name. They made me feel like I was creating drama over nothing. But Jessica was getting more uncomfortable. She finally told me that she felt like Sandra wanted her to know that Morgan was better. That they'd had more history, more plans, more everything. Jessica said Sandra would find ways to mention how successful Morgan had become at her job, how great she looked, how much fun she was. Always with this tone like she was comparing them and Jessica was losing. I confronted Sandra again about 2 months ago. Told her directly that her constant mentions of Morgan were hurting my relationship with Jessica and I needed her to stop. Sandra got defensive. She said I was being ridiculous and that Jessica must be insecure if she couldn't handle hearing about my past. She said I was trying to erase Morgan from my memory like she'd never existed, and that was immature. She pointed out that Morgan was still her friend and she wasn't going to pretend Morgan didn't exist just because I'd moved on. We went back and forth. I told her I wasn't asking her to cut off Morgan or never mention her, just to stop bringing her up every single time we were all together. Sandra finally agreed but said I was being childish about the whole thing. She said Jessica should be secure enough in our relationship not to care about my ex from years ago. After that conversation, Sandra did stop mentioning Morgan for a while. Jessica was relieved and thanked me for talking to Sandra. She said she knew how important Sandra was to me and she appreciated that I'd stood up for her. Things seemed to be getting back to normal. Then last month Jessica had to fly to Seattle for 3 weeks for a work project. She'd be gone right up until a few days before Thanksgiving. Sandra knew Jessica was away because she'd asked when Jessica was leaving and made some comment about me being a bachelor again for a few weeks. About a week after Jessica left, Sandra texted asking if I wanted to come over for dinner that Saturday. Her husband Mark was going to grill and they thought I might want company since Jessica was gone. I said sure, figured it would be good to hang out. Sandra and Mark live about 20 minutes from me in a nice subdivision. I got there around 6. Mark was out back getting the grill started and Sandra was in the kitchen. We were just chatting about work and normal stuff when the doorbell rang around 6:30. Sandra went to answer it and I heard her greeting someone. Then she walked back into the kitchen and Morgan was with her. I hadn't seen Morgan in person in almost 4 years. We'd cut off all contact when Jessica and I started getting serious. Morgan looked like she'd dressed up, wearing a nice dress and heels like she was going somewhere fancy afterward. She seemed surprised to see me, but not as surprised as she should have been if she really didn't know I'd be there. I looked at Sandra and asked what was going on. Sandra said she'd invited Morgan because she thought we could all have a nice evening together. She said Morgan had been excited to see me and catch up. She said I needed to be an adult about the situation and stop acting like Morgan didn't exist. I walked into the other room and told Sandra I needed to talk to her privately. I asked her why she'd ambushed me like this. Sandra said it wasn't an ambush. She said Morgan had been asking about me and Sandra thought enough time had passed that we could all be friends. She said Morgan was going through some stuff and could use supportive people around her. Sandra told me I was being dramatic and we should just go have a nice dinner. I told Sandra this was exactly what I'd asked her not to do. That she'd agreed to respect my boundaries and now she'd completely ignored them. Sandra said I was overreacting and that Jessica wouldn't even know about it, so what was the problem? That comment made it clear she knew exactly what she was doing. I walked back out and told Morgan I was sorry but I had to leave. Made up something about a work emergency. Morgan looked upset but she didn't say anything. I left and drove home. Sat in my car for probably 20 minutes before I could go inside. I called Jessica that night and told her everything. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she wasn't surprised. She said she'd had a feeling Sandra was trying to push us apart and get me back together with Morgan. Jessica said she was done being around Sandra and didn't feel safe around someone who was actively working against our relationship. The next day I texted Sandra and told her we were done. That she'd crossed a line I'd specifically asked her not to cross and I didn't want to be friends anymore. She tried calling me several times but I didn't answer. She finally sent a long text saying I was throwing away years of friendship over nothing and that I'd regret this. I told my mom and Katie what happened. They were both upset with me. My mom called and asked me to come over for lunch that Sunday. When I got there, Sandra was already sitting at the kitchen table. I turned to leave but my mom asked me to sit down. She said they all wanted to talk to me. I should have walked out but I sat down anyway. My mom started talking about how Sandra had been part of our family for so many years and how I was making a huge mistake. Sandra said I was being unfair and that she'd only been trying to help me. She said Morgan had been calling her upset about my engagement announcement with Jessica on social media last year and Sandra felt bad for her. She said Morgan had finally gotten her life together and was ready to settle down and Sandra thought Morgan and I could pick up where we'd left off. Katie jumped in and said she and my mom had always liked Morgan better than Jessica anyway. She said Morgan fit in better with our family and that Jessica was too different from us. My mom nodded and said it was hard for them to relate to Jessica. Then my mom said the thing that made everything clear. She said Morgan and I just looked right together. That Morgan understood our family and our background. She brought up holidays and how Morgan had known all the traditions and Jessica always seemed confused about things. Then she said she'd been thinking about grandkids and how my kids with Morgan would have looked just like our family, but kids with Jessica would look different and wouldn't really fit in at family gatherings. I asked her what she meant by that. My mom said Jessica was Korean and any kids we had would be mixed and would look Asian. She said she'd been worrying about how they'd fit into family photos and whether they'd feel out of place at family events. She said this like it was a normal concern. I just stared at her. Katie was nodding along like this made perfect sense. Sandra didn't say anything, but she didn't look surprised either. I asked my mom if she was seriously saying she wanted me to break up with Jessica because she's not white. My mom got defensive and said that wasn't what she meant, but then she kept talking and made it worse. She said it was about culture and making sure everyone felt comfortable and that she just wanted what was best for me. I stood up and said some things I probably shouldn't have said. Told my mom she was racist and that I couldn't believe she'd been working with Sandra to break up my relationship. I told Katie she was just as bad for going along with it. Then I left. My mom and Katie both sent angry texts for the next few days. Then the messages changed to apologies, but I didn't respond. Sandra never texted at all. I told Jessica everything when she got back and she listened without saying much. Jessica told me she wasn't angry or even surprised. She said when she'd told her own parents about me 2 years ago, they'd had the exact same reaction. Her parents are from Korea and they wanted her to date someone Korean. It took them several months to come around, but now they're actually excited about the wedding we're planning. She said she'd always felt something was off with my mom and Sandra and Katie, but she'd tried to ignore it. Then Jessica said something that threw me. She said she wanted to invite my mom and Katie over to talk to them. She said she didn't want to break up my family and that maybe if she talked to them directly, she could help them understand. I told her she didn't know them anything, but she insisted. I really don't know what to do here. Jessica seems determined to try to fix this, but I don't know if I can forgive what they did. And I definitely don't want Sandra in my life anymore after she set up that whole dinner ambush. Did I overreact by cutting off Sandra? Should I have handled the situation with my mom differently? Update 1, 3 weeks later. I didn't expect to post an update, but a lot has happened and I need to write it out. First off, thank you to everyone who commented on my original post. Reading the responses helped me realize I wasn't going crazy. A lot of people pointed out things I hadn't fully processed, especially about how long Sandra had probably been working on this. So here's what happened. Despite me telling her not to, Jessica went ahead and invited my mom and Katie over to our apartment. She didn't ask me again, just sent them a text with a date and time. My mom responded right away saying they'd be there. I wasn't happy about it, but Jessica said she needed to do this for herself, not for them. The day came and my mom and Katie showed up with flowers and a card for Jessica. They were already crying before they even sat down. My mom hugged Jessica and started apologizing immediately. Katie did the same. They both said they'd been wrong and that they'd spent the last few weeks thinking about what I'd said at that lunch. We all sat down and my mom did most of the talking. She said after I left that day, she and Katie had gotten into an argument with Sandra. Sandra had apparently been calling and texting them constantly since Jessica and I got serious, always talking about how Jessica wasn't right for me and how I'd been so much happier with Morgan. Sandra would send screenshots of Morgan's social media posts showing how well she was doing. She'd tell my mom that Morgan was asking about me and missed me. My mom said she realized Sandra had been planting ideas in her head for months. Little comments here and there about how Jessica didn't understand our family dynamics or how Jessica was too focused on work or how Jessica didn't laugh at the same jokes we did. Sandra would compare Jessica to Morgan constantly when I wasn't around, always making Morgan sound perfect and Jessica sound cold or difficult. Katie admitted she'd gone along with it because Sandra was her friend too and she trusted Sandra's judgment. She said Sandra had convinced her that I was making a mistake and that Jessica and I weren't compatible. Sandra told Katie that I'd confided in her that I was having doubts about Jessica, which was completely false, but Katie believed it. The thing that finally made them realize how wrong they'd been was what happened after I left that lunch. They'd tried calling me for 2 days and I wouldn't answer. On the 3rd day, Sandra came over to my mom's house and told them they needed to fix this. But instead of apologizing for setting up the dinner ambush, Sandra said they should reach out to Morgan and help arrange for Morgan and me to meet up again without telling Jessica. She said Jessica would never know and that I'd thank them eventually. That's when my mom said she realized Sandra wasn't trying to help me. Sandra was fixated on getting Morgan and me back together for her own reasons. My mom asked Sandra why she cared so much and Sandra said Morgan was her best friend and had been devastated by the breakup, and Sandra had promised Morgan that she'd help fix things. After Sandra left, my mom and Katie talked for hours. Katie looked back at old text messages from Sandra and realized how manipulative they'd been. Sandra would send messages about Jessica that were framed as concern but were really just criticism. Things like, "I'm worried Jessica is isolating him from his family," or "Do you think Jessica really loves him or just wants financial stability?" Or "I saw Jessica being really short with him at dinner and I wonder if she's always like that in private." My mom apologized to Jessica directly. She said the comments about kids and race had come from a place of fear and ignorance, not hatred. She said she'd grown up in a small town where everyone looked the same and she'd never examined her own biases. She said that wasn't an excuse, but she wanted Jessica to know she was genuinely sorry and wanted to do better. Jessica listened to all of this and then she started crying too. She told them about her own parents' initial reaction to me and how painful it had been to hear people she loved say racist things. She said she understood it was often fear of the unknown rather than actual hatred, but that it still hurt. She said she'd been trying hard to fit in with my family and it had been crushing to realize they didn't want her there at all. Then Jessica told them she wasn't going to try to change herself to fit in. She said she'd be respectful and kind, but she wasn't going to pretend to be someone else. She said if they wanted to be part of our lives and our future kids' lives, they needed to accept her as she was. My mom and Katie both agreed immediately. They stayed for almost 3 hours. By the end, everyone had cried multiple times and there was a pile of used tissues on the coffee table. My mom asked if she could hug Jessica again and Jessica said yes. Katie apologized to me separately for not standing up for Jessica and for letting Sandra influence her so much. Before they left, I asked what happened with Sandra. My mom said Sandra had sent several texts after the conversation at her house, but my mom hadn't responded. Katie said Sandra had called her twice but she didn't answer. They both agreed that Sandra had orchestrated the whole thing and that they'd been manipulated. After they left, Jessica and I talked. I told her I appreciated what she'd done but I was still processing everything. She said she understood if I needed time before I could trust my mom and Katie again. I told her I honestly didn't know if I could get past it completely. Jessica said something that stuck with me. She said she'd grown up seeing her parents slowly accept me and change their views, and she'd seen real growth in them. She said she believed people could change if they genuinely wanted to, but that I didn't owe my mom or Katie immediate forgiveness. She said I should take whatever time I needed. My mom texted me the next day asking if Jessica and I wanted to come to Thanksgiving dinner next week. She said Sandra would absolutely not be there and that she'd already told Sandra she wasn't welcome at family gatherings anymore. She said she'd also told her sister and my cousins what had happened so no one would ask about Sandra or bring up Morgan. I haven't responded yet. Part of me wants to go and try to move forward. Part of me is still angry and wants to keep my distance. Jessica said she'd support whatever I decided. The thing that bothers me most is that Sandra hasn't tried to contact me at all since that lunch at my mom's house. No apology text, no attempt to explain herself, nothing. It's like she doesn't care that a friendship of almost 20 years is over. That tells me everything I need to know about how much that friendship actually meant to her. I also found out from Katie that Morgan didn't actually know about the dinner ambush at Sandra's house. Sandra had told Morgan I'd asked to see her and wanted to reconnect. When I left that night, Morgan apparently called Sandra crying and confused about why I'd seemed so uncomfortable. Sandra told her I was just surprised and needed time. Morgan didn't know Sandra had lied to both of us. I don't know what to do with that information. Part of me thinks I should reach out to Morgan and explain what Sandra did, but Jessica said that's not my responsibility and would just open up old wounds. She's probably right. So that's where things stand. My mom and Katie seem genuinely sorry. Jessica is somehow more forgiving than I am. And Sandra is apparently fine with burning down a 20-year friendship for reasons I still don't fully understand. Update 2. Things have gotten more complicated. We ended up going to Thanksgiving at my mom's house. It was awkward at first, but my mom had clearly put in effort. She'd asked Jessica ahead of time if there were any Korean dishes she'd like included in the meal and actually made them. My aunt and uncle were welcoming to Jessica and didn't bring up Morgan once. Katie brought her boyfriend and he and Jessica ended up talking about hiking trails for like an hour. It was almost normal. Almost, because Sandra's absence was obvious to everyone. My cousins kept looking at me like they wanted to ask but didn't. My mom's sister finally said something about hoping Sandra was doing okay and my mom quickly changed the subject. It was clear the family knew something had happened but not the full story. Jessica fit in better than she ever had before. My mom asked her about her work and actually listened to the answers. Katie asked Jessica to help plan a surprise party for their mom's birthday next month. By the end of the night, I started thinking maybe we could actually move past this. Then last week I got a call from Mark, Sandra's husband. We'd never been particularly close but we'd always been friendly. He asked if we could meet for coffee and talk. I almost said no but something in his voice made me agree. We met at a place halfway between our houses. Mark looked exhausted. He said Sandra had been spiraling since Thanksgiving and he needed me to know what was actually going on. He said he was breaking Sandra's trust by telling me this but he thought I deserved to know the truth. Apparently Morgan had contacted Sandra about 6 months after Morgan and I broke up. Morgan told Sandra she'd made a mistake ending things with me and asked Sandra to help get us back together. Sandra had told her it was too soon and I needed time to heal. But Morgan kept asking. She'd call Sandra every few weeks checking if I was dating anyone, asking Sandra to bring me up in conversation, suggesting ways they could run into each other. When I started dating Jessica, Morgan lost it according to Mark. She called Sandra crying, saying she'd waited too long and now it was too late. Sandra promised Morgan she'd help fix things. Mark said he'd told Sandra to stay out of it, but she became obsessed with breaking Jessica and me up. She'd spend hours on the phone with Morgan planning different strategies. Sandra had convinced herself that Morgan and I were soulmates who'd broken up due to bad timing. She thought if she could just get us in the same room again, we'd realize we still loved each other and I'd leave Jessica. Sandra believed she was doing me a favor by saving me from making a mistake. Mark said the dinner ambush had been planned for weeks. Sandra had told Morgan I wanted to see her but was too afraid to reach out directly. She'd coached Morgan on what to wear and what to say. When I left that night, Sandra had called Morgan and told her I just needed more time and they should try again. After my mom cut Sandra off, things got worse. Morgan had apparently taken out a loan from her parents and given Sandra $5,000 to help coordinate getting us back together. Sandra had already spent $2,000 of it on what Mark called reconnaissance, driving past our apartment, paying for background check services to find out details about Jessica's life, and buying gifts she planned to send to me with notes from Morgan. When my mom refused to help anymore, Sandra panicked because she'd already spent Morgan's money and had nothing to show for it. She'd promised Morgan they'd be back together by Christmas. Mark said Sandra had become erratic and paranoid, convinced that everyone was conspiring against her. Mark showed me texts between Sandra and Morgan. They were disturbing. Morgan was talking about how Jessica had stolen her life and how she deserved a second chance with me. Sandra was feeding into it, telling Morgan that Jessica was probably manipulating me and isolating me from people who really cared. Some of the texts were from just a few days ago. I asked Mark why he was telling me this now. He said Sandra had started talking about showing up at our apartment to confront Jessica directly. He said he was worried Sandra might actually do it and he wanted to warn me. He also said he'd told Sandra he wanted a separation because he couldn't be part of this anymore. I thanked Mark and left. Called Jessica immediately and told her everything. She was quiet for a long time, then said we should think about getting a doorbell camera and maybe changing our locks if Sandra had ever been given a key. I realized Sandra had helped us move in and had a key for emergencies. I changed the locks that afternoon. I texted my mom and told her what Mark had said. She called me back within 5 minutes, panicking. She said Sandra had driven by her house twice in the last week and had left a note in the mailbox asking my mom to reconsider. My mom had thrown the note away without reading it all, but now she was worried. Katie called next and said Sandra had messaged her on social media asking to meet up and talk. Katie had ignored it, but now she was concerned too. We all decided to block Sandra on everything. My mom said if Sandra showed up at her house, she'd call the police. I told Jessica I'd do the same if Sandra came to our apartment. I also reached out to Morgan through social media. Sent her a direct message explaining that Sandra had lied to both of us and that I was happy with Jessica and had no interest in rekindling anything. I told her Sandra had been manipulating her and she should ask for her money back. I kept it brief and clear. Morgan responded an hour later. She said she didn't believe me and that Sandra had proven she was a real friend by trying to help. She said Jessica and I wouldn't last and that she'd wait for me to come to my senses. Then she blocked me before I could respond. Jessica read the message over my shoulder and said we should save screenshots of everything in case we needed them later. She was thinking more clearly than I was. That night Jessica asked me if I regretted how everything had gone down. If I wished I'd handled things differently with Sandra. I told her the truth, that I was sad about losing a friend I'd had for so long, but that Sandra had made her choices and I'd made mine. Jessica said she was proud of me for standing up for us even when it cost me a friendship. We installed the doorbell camera the next day. I also told my boss what was happening in case Sandra tried to contact me at work. My boss said he'd alert security and they'd handle it if she showed up. It's been a week since then and nothing has happened. No sign of Sandra. Mark texted to say he'd moved out and filed for separation. He apologized again for not stepping in sooner. My mom invited us to her birthday dinner Katie is planning. She said it would just be immediate family and Jessica's parents if they wanted to come. Jessica's parents said they'd drive up for it. I think my mom is trying to make up for lost time. I don't know what happens next with Sandra. Part of me hopes she gets help and moves on. Part of me is waiting for another shoe to drop. Update 3. I'm writing this from a hotel room because we can't stay at our apartment right now. Sandra showed up at our apartment 3 nights ago. Jessica and I were watching TV around 9 when the doorbell rang. The camera showed Sandra standing there holding something. I didn't answer. She rang the bell 4 more times, then started knocking. She was yelling through the door that she needed to talk to me, that she had information I needed to hear, that Jessica was lying to me about something. I called the police. Told them someone was harassing us and refusing to leave. Sandra was still knocking when the squad car pulled up. She immediately started crying and telling the officers that I was her best friend and she was worried about me. The officers asked her to leave and she did, but not before shouting through the door that Morgan loved me and Jessica was using me. The officers took our statement and said they'd file a report. They said if Sandra came back, we should call again and they could arrest her for trespassing. They left and Jessica and I sat there for an hour just listening for any sounds outside. We ended up pushing furniture against the door before we could sleep. The next day my mom called. Sandra had gone to her house at 6 in the morning and banged on the door until my mom threatened to call the police. Sandra had left but not before shoving a folder through the mail slot. My mom opened it and found printed social media posts of Jessica with male coworkers, photos from work events where Jessica was laughing with other men. Sandra had circled the men in red marker and written dates and times on each photo. On a separate page she'd written accusations that Jessica was cheating on me. My mom called me immediately and I drove over to get the folder. The photos were all from Jessica's public social media and were completely innocent. Jessica standing in a group at a company holiday party. Jessica sitting at a table with coworkers at a conference. Sandra had taken normal photos and tried to make them look suspicious. I took the folder to the police station and added it to the report. The officer I spoke with said this was escalating into stalking behavior and they'd follow up with Sandra. He suggested we consider a restraining order. That afternoon Katie called crying. Sandra had sent her a long email claiming Jessica had faked her work credentials and was only with me for my money. The email included links to news articles about romance scams and immigrants using marriage for citizenship. Katie said the email was unhinged and she'd blocked Sandra everywhere but wanted to warn me. Jessica's parents called that evening. Someone had sent them an anonymous email in Korean claiming their daughter was bringing shame to their family by dating me and that she was pregnant and hiding it from them. The email had enough specific details about Jessica's life that it scared them. I told them it was Sandra and explained everything. They said they'd save the email and report it if needed. That's when we decided to leave the apartment for a few days. We're staying at a hotel while we figure out next steps. Jessica took time off work because she doesn't want to be alone. We've both filed for restraining orders. The hearings are next week. Mark called yesterday and said Sandra had cleaned out their joint bank account and he didn't know where she'd gone. He said her parents were trying to reach her but she wasn't responding to them either. He gave me permission to share his number with the police if needed. My mom and Katie have been checking in constantly. They both feel guilty for not seeing how unstable Sandra had become. My mom keeps saying she should have cut Sandra off years ago when the behavior first started. I told her this isn't her fault but I don't think she believes me. Jessica has been incredibly calm through all of this. She's the one making lists of evidence, organizing files, researching legal options. She said her parents went through something similar with a family member back in Korea and she learned early how to document everything. I don't know what I'd do without her. The police called this morning. They'd gone to Sandra's apartment for a welfare check based on Mark's report and found her there. She refused to talk to them but they confirmed she was alive and not an immediate danger to herself. They served her with a notice about the restraining order hearing and warned her about the consequences of continued contact. We're waiting to see what happens at the hearing. Our lawyer says we have a strong case given the documented harassment and the disturbing content of Sandra's communications. Jessica's taking it day by day. She asked me last night if I was okay and I realized she's been so focused on handling the practical aspects that she hasn't processed how scary this is. We talked for a long time about everything. About how a friendship I'd valued for 20 years had turned into this. About how my mom's racism and Sandra's obsession had combined into something toxic. About whether we should have seen this coming. Jessica said something that made sense. She said sometimes people build up a version of reality in their heads that's so different from actual reality that they can't see the truth anymore. Sandra had decided Morgan and I were meant to be together and Jessica was the obstacle, and nothing was going to change her mind. She'd spent so much time and energy on this narrative that she couldn't let it go without admitting she'd been wrong all along. We don't know what happens next. The restraining order hearing is in 5 days. Our lawyer thinks we'll get it based on the evidence. Mark said he'd testify if needed about Sandra's behavior. My mom and Katie both said they'd come to the hearing for support. Jessica asked me last night if I thought Sandra would ever stop. I didn't know what to tell her. I want to believe Sandra will get help and move on with her life. But I also know people don't usually get to this point and just suddenly become rational again. For now we're staying at the hotel. We've extended our stay another week while we decide if we feel safe going back to the apartment or if we should look for a new place. Jessica's company offered to let her work remotely permanently if we want to move to a different city. We're considering it. My mom keeps asking if there's anything she can do. I told her she's doing it by being supportive now and by believing us about how serious this is. She and Katie came by the hotel yesterday with food and just sat with us for a while. No one really knew what to say, but it helped to not be alone. I never thought it would end like this. 20 years of friendship destroyed because Sandra couldn't accept that people move on and build new lives. Morgan sent one final message before Jessica blocked her on my behalf. She said she knew I'd come back to her eventually and she'd keep waiting. That message scared Jessica more than anything Sandra had done because it meant this wasn't over for either of them. We're getting through it one day at a time. The restraining order hearing will help. Moving might help. But there's a part of me that knows we'll be looking over our shoulders for a long time. Jessica deserves better than this. She didn't sign up to deal with my ex's friend stalking us and my family's initial rejection of her. But she's still here and she's still fighting for us, and that means everything. I'll update after the hearing if anyone wants to know what happens. For now, we're just trying to stay safe and keep moving forward.